this video, we're going to talk about how to structure an answer to a California bar exam essay question. We're going to be using the July 2019 Civil Procedure essay as an example, so you may find it helpful to review that essay prior to watching this video if you haven't already. So to begin with, I want to talk about a few principles that you should think about and apply as you're writing an essay response to a California bar exam essay question. First of all, remember who your grader is. The essays are graded by typically practicing attorneys, practicing judges, people who are being paid to grade these essays. They're not often law school professors. So when they grade the essays, they're usually working off of some sort of rubric, which tells them what issues to look for, what arguments to look for, and where to give you points. So unlike in law school, where your professor may come across something in an essay answer that maybe the professor hadn't thought about and award you points for it anyway because it's a good creative argument, here you're less likely to see that, given that the graders are working off this strict rubric. They may not know what to do with an argument that you make that isn't similar to what they see on their rubric. So it's really important that you learn how to write essays in a way that's easy for the grader to grade them. That's what's going to get you the most points on these essays. Second, these graders are grading a lot of essays. Once they read the same essay over and over and over, they kind of know what they're looking for, and there's a really good chance that they're going to just start to skim your answer. So for this reason, it's important that you highlight things that you know are really important or that you're really confident about in your essay. So if you have keywords, for instance, you should bold or underline them in your answer to make them stick out. This is especially true when you're talking about a rule that has really important key language. For instance, in a civil procedure essay that tests personal jurisdiction, things like minimum contacts and purposeful availment should be bolded to make them jump out at the grader, which is going to make it look like you know exactly what you're talking about. Third, the graders value organization. The easier you make their lives, the more points they're going to give you. So as you're writing your answer, it is so crucial that you use IRAC to format your answer, and specifically that you use headings to separate the various IRACs or issues in this essay. If you take a look at the sample student answers that California has released, you'll see that the high-scoring student answers almost always stick to a very strict IRAC format. They're very well organized, which makes it easier for the graders to grade. Finally, don't worry about writing eloquently. You may have a ton of issues to discuss. Sometimes on the evidence essays, for instance, California will include up to like 30 issues within one essay. So in an hour, you don't have a lot of time to write detail on all 30 of those issues, nor do you have time to make your writing look beautiful. It's more important that you get the right substance on the page. The graders are looking for you to state the law. They're looking for your analysis. Can you apply the law to the facts? And can you reach a conclusion for that issue? So sometimes your IRAC may be pretty short. You may only have 1 to 2 sentences of law, 1 to 2 sentences of analysis, and then a brief 1-sentence conclusion. And that's okay. You don't need to include a lot of fluff in these answers to get high scoring points. They will score you based on the substance that's there, not on how eloquently it's stated. So let's talk about how to put these tips into use and how to approach a bar exam essay. To start, you may find it helpful to read the call of the question first. This is something you should practice as you're studying for the exam. Try reading the call of the question first. Try not reading the call of the question first and see if it helps you do better on the essays. Sometimes California will give you some specific guidance in the call of the question. And for this reason, this is why you would want to at least look at the call of the question, if not read the call of the question before reading the fact pattern. Now, I will say California is notorious for not giving you guidance in the call of the question. A very typical California essay will give you a fact pattern, and then at the end of the fact pattern, it'll just say something like, discuss the issues, or analyze Bob's arguments, and they won't tell you what the arguments are. You have to come up with the arguments. So if this is the case, certainly the call of the question isn't very helpful. But in recent years, California has gotten more specific with the call of the question. So for example, in July 2019, you can see here that the call of the question in the civil procedure essay was pretty specific. They broke down 4 specific issues that they wanted you to look at. So here we see that the call of the question said, number 1, how should the court rule on Priscilla's motion to compel further responses to her interrogatories to Grocery? Discuss. Number 2, how should the court rule on each of Grocery's motions to compel? Discuss. Number 3, was Grocery's response to Priscilla's interrogatory about its experts proper? Discuss. And number 4, should the court sustain Grocery's assertion of privilege with regard to Xavier? And discuss. So it might not seem super intuitive to read the bottom of the essay question first, but there's 2 helpful things that we find from reading this particular call of the question. Number 1, we can tell this is a civil procedure question, so we know the subject of the question instantly. We saw some key words in the call of the question, like motion to compel, interrogatory. We saw them ask about privilege. So that should instantly put you in the mindset of civil procedure. Number 2, when they ask those specific questions, now you know what to look for in the fact pattern. Now we know we need to watch out for the motion to compel. We need to watch out for the assertion of privilege. And it gives us an idea of what we're looking for so that we don't have to read and hold on to every single fact of the fact pattern. We can read it and know where to focus our attention. So now if you read the fact pattern after you read the call of the question, it will hopefully make it a little bit easier on you to focus your attention on what's the most important. Now, some students don't find this helpful. Sometimes they find it distracting and they'd rather read the fact pattern from the start to the finish and not read the call of the question first. But like I said a few minutes ago, I recommend trying it both ways and see what works best for you before just simply deciding on a method. So how do you approach writing a bar exam essay? Now that we've read the call of the question, and let's say we've read the fact pattern, how do we begin writing? What do we do? I cannot stress enough the importance of IRAC on the California bar exam essays. IRAC stands for Issue, Rule, Analysis, Conclusion. Every single issue that you discuss on a California essay should take this format. Again, if you look at the sample student answers that California has released, they almost always use a very strict IRAC approach to writing their answers. This is a huge helpful hint that organization is essential to a high score on a California essay. So a basic IRAC formatted answer would look just like this, where you see issue 1, which is just going to be your heading, and then underneath the heading, you'll have a rule, an analysis, and a conclusion. Same thing for issue 2, and then same thing for issue 3. And you may have a ton of issues to go through, so you might have a ton of IRACs on your essay. I recommend that your issue statement be a brief snippet of a sentence. It doesn't have to be a full sentence. Don't waste time making it beautiful. Remember, we're talking about quickly getting the right substance down, not writing eloquently. And then for the separate rule, analysis, and conclusion, I would put these into separate paragraphs. So underneath your heading, you should have a paragraph for your rules, then a space, and then a paragraph for your analysis, and a space, and then a paragraph for your conclusion, even if the conclusion is just a brief 1 sentence. And this serves 2 purposes. Number 1, by separating the rule, the analysis, and the conclusion, it makes your answer more organized and it's easier for the grader to read. If they can quickly see where your rule ends and your conclusion begins, and your analysis begins, They know what points to allocate for those various portions of your answer. If they look at your answer and it's just one giant long paragraph, it's a little bit daunting. They really have to do some work to think about where the rule ends and the analysis begins. So make it easy on the grader. The other important piece to separating your essay out like this is that it serves as a good checklist for yourself to make sure that you included all the key components of the essay. It's very common for students to overlook the analysis, and they will just have a rule and a conclusion. So if you separate your essay into 3 distinct paragraphs underneath each heading, and you look back at your answer and you only see 2 paragraphs, that's a good hint to yourself that you forgot something. So separating it out like this is a useful tool to make sure that you include everything you need to in your essay. So let's talk about some specific tips for each of these particular pieces of the IRAC. So first of all, the issues. There are often a lot of issues on the California essays, and even when they give you more guidance as to what to discuss, like we saw in that civil procedure question, issue spotting is still a huge part of the California essays. So identifying the issues correctly and making the issues stand out to the grader is so important. They're going to award points for spotting the right issues. So you want to make it clear to them right up front that you've spotted the right issues. So by separating each issue into its own heading that's bolded and underlined and short and succinct so that the grader can quickly glance at that issue and see that you're on the right track is going to make it easier for them to grade, which in turn means more points for you. For the rule statement, if you see them testing, let's say, an exception to the rule, instead of just diving straight into the exception, start with the general rule. So for instance, if they're testing the dying declaration exception to hearsay, start with hearsay. Give a definition of hearsay, give the rule for hearsay, and then move into your exception for the dying declaration. Start at the broadest part of the rule and work your way down to the narrower and narrower rules. And learning when you need more detail in your rule statement is going to come through practice. Sometimes they are looking for more detail in a rule statement, and sometimes they just want you to get to the point. So practicing the highly tested issues and taking note of how much detail they include in their rule statements for those highly tested issues is going to be incredibly helpful to making sure you include just enough so that you get all the points, but not so much that you're wasting time and taking time away from discussing other important things in your essay. The analysis portion is arguably the most important portion of your essay. There's a few things you want to make sure you include in your analysis. Number one, you should incorporate as many of the facts as you can into your analysis. California bar exam essays are usually pretty short. The fact pattern can be anywhere from half a page to a full page, but that's not a lot to work with when you have an hour to write this essay. So there is a very good chance that every fact that they give you in that fact pattern is important and is there for a reason. So you want to make sure that you are incorporating as many of those facts as possible into your analysis of your essay. It's also possible, given how short the fact patterns are, that they don't even give you all the facts that you need. So the analysis is the point where you should speculate on additional facts, not make them up, but point out in your answer what additional facts are necessary to come to a full conclusion of the issue. So you could say, for instance, in order to fully analyze this issue, we would also need to know X, Y, and Z. So by speculating, you're identifying to the grader that you are so competent and familiar with this issue that you know exactly what else we would need to know here. Another thing that you should do in your analysis is consider the arguments that both parties will make. So if the call of the question says, address Bob's arguments, and Ann is the one who is suing Bob, your analysis should say something like, Bob will argue, and then Bob's argument, and Ann will respond, and then Anne's response to that argument. Now, this isn't always possible. Sometimes someone has such a strong argument that there just isn't a response. But if the facts seem vague, where they could be argued different ways, this is the place to do that. Argue both sides of an issue in your analysis. You do want to make sure to come out with who has the stronger argument and ultimately conclude. So don't leave it open-ended and say anyone could win here. If it's possible to weigh those arguments, make sure you finish up your IRAC with a conclusion. Sometimes there's a correct conclusion and sometimes there's not. And so when there is a correct conclusion, if you're looking at the high-scoring student answers, what you might see is that they both reach the same answer. So if you do an essay and on a particular issue, both of the high-scoring student answers have the exact same conclusion, that's probably the right answer. And so you would need to reach that same conclusion to get full credit for that issue. On the other hand, sometimes the high-scoring student answers reach opposite conclusions. One will say one thing and the other student answer has the opposite outcome. So if you see something like that, that tells you that the conclusion is not as important. That doesn't mean you shouldn't conclude. You should still include a conclusion, but it just means that which conclusion you put isn't going to affect your score. You'll get points for concluding, but there's no right answer. So let's put that into practice using that civil procedure question that we looked at. Remember that your headings should speak directly to the questions that they are posing. In that Civ Pro question, they asked 4 distinct questions that we need to address in our answer. So the first thing that I would do to set up my answer is make sure I am clearly addressing every single point that they asked me to address. And it's also a good idea to number your answers so that they can see which portion of your answer corresponds to that particular question. This is going to allow the grader to make sure that you answered all the parts of the question. So here you can see that that first question was with regard to Priscilla's motion to compel responses to interrogatories. That's all you need for a heading here. You don't need to make it a conclusion. You don't need to make it a full sentence. We just need a brief statement identifying the issue that we're about to discuss. We are strong proponents of not putting your conclusion up front. So your heading doesn't have to be a conclusion, nor do you need a sentence underneath your heading with a conclusion or any other type of issue statement. Your heading is sufficient for the issue statement. We think it's more important to just include your conclusion at the end for 2 reasons. Number 1, if your conclusion happens to be wrong and it's right up front, you're telling the grader right up front that you're about to be wrong. And so they may not give as much credit to some of the other things you say. You might have a great rule statement, but in the grader's mind, they already know that you're wrong. So they're already starting to fade away and discredit some of the things you say. So you don't want to let them know right up front that you're about to be wrong. Instead, just include the conclusion at the end. That way, if you do happen to be wrong, they've already looked at your rule and your analysis and given it points that it deserves. The other reason to conclude at the end is because it's possible that you will change your mind. Maybe after working your way through the analysis, you decide to conclude the opposite way. So if you include a conclusion at the beginning and then change your mind, now you have to go back and rewrite your conclusion at the beginning, or what typically happens here is students forget to rewrite that conclusion. So now they started out by concluding one way, and by the time you get to the end of the IRAC, they've concluded the opposite. And that looks problematic. It looks like you're confused. It looks like you're not quite sure what's going on. So you do get points for concluding your essay, but you don't get points for concluding twice, so there's really no real benefit to including a conclusion at the beginning. Just start with an issue statement at the beginning and put your conclusion at the end. The other thing I want to discuss here is question number 2. So question number 2 asked us to address groceries' motions to compel. It was plural. So we knew when we were looking at the facts of this particular essay that we need to look for multiple motions to compel. And for this reason, I separated this particular question into two parts, 2A and 2B, because once you read the facts, you can see that there are two distinct motions to compel. There was a motion to compel a mental and physical exam and a motion to compel tax returns. These are going to have different analyses. So it's important to separate these out so that you're able to fully analyze each one. Within each of these issues, it is incredibly likely that you will see sub-issues. And when you're addressing sub-issues, I think it's very helpful to do some sort of font change to make those sub-issues stand out to the grader. Show them that you recognize this is part of the larger issue, but it really needs its own IRAC. So, taking that first question of this particular essay, which was about Priscilla's motion to compel responses to interrogatories, you can see here that there's a number of sub-issues that need to be discussed with regard to this motion to compel. We have to talk about what is the proper scope of discovery, and if this is about discoverable material. We have to talk about the timing of discovery and whether she made her motion to compel timely. This particular question dealt with the number of interrogatories. Parties are only entitled to a certain number of interrogatories in a lawsuit, and they went beyond the allotted number here. And then they also needed to discuss the need to meet and confer prior to filing this type of motion. So all of these things were sub-issues that need to be addressed within this first main question. Now, certainly you could incorporate all of these different rules into one giant rule paragraph and discuss all of this at once. And that would get all of the information on the page. But you're making this a lot harder on the grader. So if your rule statement had said, for instance, here's the scope of discovery, here's the timing of discovery, here's how many interrogatories you get, and here's what you have to do before you're allowed to file a motion to compel, and you put it all in one paragraph, and then you move to the next paragraph and you analyze all four of those things at once, that's a lot of work for the grader to do. They have to keep going back and forth between your rule and your analysis to make sure that you're talking about the right thing. So rather than putting that burden on the grader, make it easier on them and break these issues down into sub-issues. So a good rule of thumb is anytime you have a piece of a rule, it may need its own sub-issue. You will see the same thing in high-scored answers for negligence, for instance. You have an overall rule statement that talks about the elements of negligence being duty, breach, causation, and damages. And then the really good answers, rather than combining all of that into one giant analysis paragraph, will have a subheading for duty, a subheading for breach, a subheading for actual cause, a subheading for proximate cause, and a subheading for damages, and then additional subheadings for any other miscellaneous negligence issues that need to be discussed there. So by breaking this down and having a mini IRAC for each of these subparts, you're going to make it easier on the grader, and you're going to ensure that you incorporate everything necessary. Now, these rules, analyses, and conclusions for these sub-issues might be incredibly short. It might just be a sentence or two for each one, and that's okay. You probably don't have time to go into a ton of detail here. But by breaking it down this way, you're more likely to hit on everything you need for this essay answer and then get the most points possible. So as you can see, this is going to make it clear to the grader that you've addressed every single issue and all the subparts to those issues. You will also have included all the substance you need. You'll state the rule, you'll have an analysis, and you'll conclude for every single piece here. Organization on California essays is crucial to a high score, so I hope you're able to implement these strategies on your own essays.